Iron Goddess of Mercy is a long poem that channels the vengeful energies of the Furies to address modern day issues of systemic racism, colonialism, climate destruction, and genocide in 64 dense Highborn, with influences ranging from Hannah Arendt to Muppets creator Jim Henson, from Bing Crosby to the Dead Milkmen, from Rita Wong to Mao Zedong and the Tao Te Ching. Larissa Lai blends them all together in a dense stew of language with a haiku to cleanse the palate. Larissa Lai is the author of two previous books of poetry and two novels, holds a Canada Research Chair in Creative Writing at the University of Calgary, where she directs the Insurgent Architects House for Creative Writing. Larissa, welcome.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We met in China, did we not?
Yes, we did. Or perhaps in the airport on the way there, I think.
Isn't that something?
That was a really extraordinary trip, actually. When I look back on it, I kind of can't believe it. It was amazing.
Because of the way that poets were treated, because of a government reaching out to poets around the world to invite them to go there, or what, and the camaraderie of poets from around the world, connections that were made that maybe lifelong connections. What other things about it did you value?
Yeah, it was that for sure. Just the extraordinary scale of the trip, right? That we had been invited there. I don't know how many of us were there, 30, 50 foreign writers. They invited and an equal number of Chinese writers. And then they bussed us around all over the countryside in Qinghai province. And we got to see the birthplace of the Yellow River. How amazing is that, right? To be in those on those lands at that time with people, from people from all over the world, and also in a different kind of configuration than when one gets an invitation from Europe or here in Canada. So when one gets an invitation from the US, right? And even if it's made international, the formation of the how international is imagined is different. And I found that very, very interesting. So like they were, folks from Pakistan there, that they were folks from South and Central America. They're sort of the old communist orbit in a sense, made for a different, very, and I had never had that kind of experience before. So that was extraordinary. Yeah.
As a person whose family comes from Hong Kong, but there must have been some conflicting feelings about dealing with the Chinese government.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Especially now. Uh, um, I mean, in that moment, my way of approaching these things in general is that if someone is generous and makes an invitation and I'm interested and compelled by it, I try not to be too dukes up. I guess I am it's the hopeful part of me that wants the relationships to be built, and that wants to meet people. And I mean, if there was something amazing about that trip, it is that we got to have those conversations, right? And one of the things they did, which wasn't so great, was they put all the Chinese writers in one bus and all the quote unquote international writers in the other bus. And so we didn't so much get to talk to the Chinese writers. And that was one thing that I really felt was lacking. But just the chance to have those conversations, I think, you know, is amazing. Now, of course, think with all that's going on in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang as well, yeah, feeling pretty disgruntled with the current configuration of PRC government. And that's fraught and painful, and sometimes I'm quite angry. But that doesn't necessarily mean I'm angry at people, though, you know? Like governments can do really crummy, lousy, more than that, violent, genocidal, terrible things. It doesn't necessarily mean that the population, that the people, that the writers are, it's not that we aren't responsible. I mean, I think anybody who's a citizen of a country is responsible for what that country does at some level, but it's a different kind of responsibility, I would say, than if I were to punch you in the nose right now, right? That would be a very direct kind of bad Larissa thing to do, and I should apologize. But if your government and my government are are there's contention, or your government is doing something crummy to my people, I would probably still talk to you. You'd be pissed off at your government. But so I think, these are the things, right? That, yeah, I'm not sorry to have gone on that trip. Um,
And that you forgive the governments of the countries is being put in practice because you're talking to a citizen of the United States whose foreign policy is on a par with communist China.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. If you think of, US imperial activities all over the world, right?
Yeah, 1,000 military bases around the world, or whatever it is. We won't get into that, or we will maybe through the context of, or through the lens of your book. Tell us about Highborn. Did Fred Watt turn you on to Highborn?
Yes. But yeah, I mean, Fred is an old friend. And in fact, it's through Fred that trip came about, now that I think about it. Because he had gone on, they'd done it more than once. And he'd gone on an early iteration of it and told me about it and given me their name, given them my name. So yeah, Fred is an old friend. I've known him since my 20s. And we were friends. And then eventually, I came back to school in my late 30s. And he was one of my profs at that time. So I've known him for a very, very long time. I'm obviously a huge fan of his work. The most famous one is Diamond Grill, with which Iron Goddess actually shares some things, right? This sort of energetic kind of tumbling sense of narrative. But there's an earlier, yeah, that one, yeah. Beautiful. It's a beautiful book for any readers who are not aware. But there's an earlier book called Waiting for Saskatchewan, in which actually contains sort of Highborn, kind of more traditionally structured. Yeah, that one. So in the later half of that book, there's a long poem called Mother, Father, Highborn, where he's thinking about his family as one does, and for Fred, it's really like so much of the conversation is with his dad. But that one's Mother, Father, Highborn. And yeah, he's just sort of thinking beside them about his childhood and the places from which they come and the territories in which he grew up, so the Kootenays. And it's that structure that he engages there. So I did learn it from him. Roy Kuka does it as well, though, the Highborn form.
Say again?
Roy Kuka.
Oh, Roy Kuka, yes, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my bookshelf is in the other room. I pulled it up. It's over there.
Well, my W's happen to be right next to me there, so I have to reach up for the Gary Snyders, but I'm right next to the William Carlos Williams and the Ann Waldman and the Walt Whitman and the W's and Fred Y. And Phyllis Webb is not far. So the seed for Highborn was planted by Fred and Roy, but tell us about how Iron Goddess of Mercy, how you first envisioned that this would happen.
Sure. So I don't know if envisioning is really, there was nothing deliberate about the writing of this book. Yeah, as we've just been discussing, there's been a ramping of anti-democratic repression in Hong Kong. And that's something that's very, very much on my mind, as a second generation Hong Kong person. And then here in Canada, as I know in the US as well, we've been having a lot of upheaval around a range of very complex issues. And here we've been calling it the dumpster fire in CanLit, a sort of a sense of deep discontent with how the industry, the field, the discipline is formed, the overrepresentation of white folks, the lack of access for Black, Indigenous, people of color, exclusions of women, exclusions of GBLTQ2S folk, queer people. And also the Me Too movement, right, has been also sort of shaking things. up here as down there in the US. And a lot of, I really believe in the activist work, Paul. I really, really think it's important, you know? Like, I think it's important that people who inhabit racialized bodies and who are carrying, you know, histories, memories, historical memory in the body. So for Black folks of slavery and its aftermath, for Indigenous folks of land theft and its ongoingness. Right here now, you know, we're going through this very heart-wrenching, painful moment when uh, the graves of children who were murdered in the residential schools are being uncovered, and it's devastating, it's brutal. And I think the only people who can speak of those things with, it's not just authority, it's a kind of, I've been using the term poetical, borrowing from Joan Redelac. It's very helpful for me because it sort of steers away from those sort of essentialized modes that I think a lot of people take up because they can't see another way. So if this poetry has something to contribute to this, it is that sense of movement in language and a shifting language-based ethics. Yeah, so anyway, so I do think that, you know, embodiment and the embodiment of history is really, really important. But I also think the relationships are really important, the relationships through and across, right? So sure, from white folks to BIPOC folks, but also within that designation, which is such an artificial, you know, awkward designation we call BIPOC, because it encompasses such a broad range of folks carrying a broad range of histories, not all of them necessarily comfortable with one another. Because if anything, if there's anything that colonialism and imperialism has done, right, it's divide and conquer. It's pitted people against one another, and people have done, you know, from one racialized position to the next, deep harms that don't and probably shouldn't resolve easily. So for me, I mean, this whole moment has just been one in which there's been a lot of intense feeling. And I'm witnessing, you know, my younger friends and colleagues feeling these feelings as well. And in a lot of cases, driving towards sort of absolute positions on the contents, because for them, that's what it is to be political. I get that. I do that sometimes too. I mean, sometimes it sort of seems, okay, there is a clear thing. Somebody needs to be called out. Somebody does need a punch in the nose. Who's going to do it, right? And so the activist in me is like, okay, well, let's do it. Let's do it. But oftentimes it's not like that. Like there are areas that are gray, and we're being pushed to decide that it's gray. But if you don't decide, it seems like a cop-out. So I think that that's the thing that Iron Goddess is sort of trying to deal with is, yeah, I do feel very passionate about these things. They're damn painful, you know? And so one can't either go to this sort of some of the high formalisms that have been more, that were more fashionable a decade ago, where, you know, the author is dead and there's nothing but the text, and we want, you know, there's nothing but pure form, pure structure. No, that's like doesn't work for me, because I think this work still needs to be connected to the world. It needs to be connected to people. It needs to be connected to history. It needs to be connected to bodies and bodies of experience. It needs to be connected, you know, to the full sort of density of our lives here on Turtle Island. And yet it's not my nature, I think. I guess because, you know, and I wonder if part of this has to do, thinking back to that trip to China, with a kind of, I still love my people. I still love Chinese people, you know? So even though the Chinese government is doing like crappy things, I can't go and therefore all Chinese people are crap. I just can't, right? So it's that, it's, you know, it's that sort of trying to deal with these flows of affect that are profoundly political in some sense, uh, without veering into that thing that Ray Chow calls the fascist belongings in our midst.
When you were talking about your younger friends who are really upset about the way things are going, I wanted to say either you're non-binary or you're not.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
so all this undercurrent, then on top of that is placed a pandemic lockdown, out of which emerges, based on the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, 64 hexagramish Highborn, for you to have a container of usually about a page, sometimes a page and a half, 2 pages, followed with a haiku, to see where your mind, the moment, and the language may take you. So was it that free time that you had by being locked in your house like the rest of us about a year and a half ago?
The bulk of this book was actually written before the pandemic hit. So I was editing and revising just as COVID landed. And of course the book came out. When did the book came out in the middle of it, right? I think so.
April? Well, I saw a review in April, so it was
Yeah.
before April this year.
So it came out just after the pandemic started. And I was doing the last, working with the wonderful poet Trish Salah on what we were calling the poetics read. A lot of folks will call it sensitivity read. So I was doing that with her as the pandemic hit. So it wasn't so much having time. I did other things while the pandemic was on, but this was pretty much done by then. But I did have the chance, the pandemic hit, and I think I did have a chance to add a little bit of language acknowledging the moment of the pandemic. I mean, the curious weirdo thing is the book prior to this one, The Tiger Flu, is about a pandemic, and it came out just before, and so that was sort of weird to still talking about that book when this one came out, and to have that one very much sort of in the thick of thinking about that. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there is pandemic thinking in this book because of still carrying the tiger flu with me. Not everything is conscious, right? And the language is so sort of double, tripled, sort of multiplied over that any sort of drive towards sort of meaning or content always slips away again. And things can slip in as well to the language. So in terms of the I Ching and the Highborn, one thing I was going to say that I didn't earlier around the Highborn form is that, and this how this thing started, is it didn't start as Highborn. It was just, so speaking of that sort of like rolling, tumbling, sort of endlessly flowing barrage of language that sort of makes up the sort of page and a half prosy parts of the poem. Initially, that's all there was. There were no haiku. It wasn't Highborn. It was just wall-to-wall block text. Like it was a rant that was just going and going and going and going for pages and pages and pages and pages and days and days and days and days. And at an early stage in the writing, my good friend and colleague Dina Alkasim arranged a reading for me at Green College at UBC. And many of my lovely friends, I'm sure some of them you will know, all the kids who are no longer kids from Strathcona. So, Fred Wong, and Pauline Butling, Peter Quartermain, and Meredith, and Daphne, and Bridget. A lot of my, they're my friends, they're my mentors and my teachers. And they very graciously came to hear me. And I was reading the thing. And it was so breathless, Paul, I just broke down crying. I just broke down and could not, and I was like there, and there were students, and there was, Dina was there, and former colleagues, and I just couldn't stop. It was really quite embarrassing, but also, just also, I guess it's no wonder because there's so much affect, there's so much emotion in the thing. So I definitely sort of like grabbing back onto that thing that I think poetry has been trying to put aside for a long time. Some ways of being poetry has been trying to put aside.
Emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Paul, I broke down. It was impossible to read, and I still wasn't sure what it was. Like at that point, it was still very much kind of an experiment. I was just receiving all this language, right? And that, you know, Dina and a couple of other friends, my friend Smile Camberley, thought, you know, this is a poem. It's a poem. Like, okay, it's a poem. It's a poem. Now, what do I do with it? Because I can't read it. And then I was at a workshop with my friend Monica Kim Gagnon, the critic and writer, and with the teacher, Dina Metzger in Los Angeles. One year, I guess, the summer before the pandemic, trying to figure out what the heck and what to do. And Dina really wanted me to slow it down. She said, you know, it's just, there's too much there. I don't know what to do with this. I have to slow it down. I'm like, I don't even know how to slow this down. If I pull it apart, I think it will just break it. So I don't know. But curiously, Monica was working on a project on Teresa Hakim Cha and trying to figure out how to structure it. And Dina said to her, have you ever heard of this Japanese poetic form called Highborn? And Monica said, yeah, I've heard of it. I could try it. She tried it. It's like, this ain't working. And I was like, oh, you know, maybe, possibly that's the thing. And so I tried it, and sure enough, right, those little resting spots by putting them sort of periodically, by sort of seeing where there was potential for break. And what it actually ended up doing, you know, most of these things, like the block chunks, were written over the course of a day, right? So each one is written over the course of a day. And so if I just broke them down by the day, by, you know, what I'd done, the work I'd done over the course of the day, and then put the haiku between, the poem became readable, and probably, I hope, a little bit more legible. I mean, it's a strange kind of legibility because the language is so polysemic and it's such a tumble, but I think it gave space to readers as well, to sort of give them as well something to hang their hats on, so they also are not too overwhelmed by it. So there's something very human, I think, about the Highborn form, you know, that sort of make the poem possible. I had to have an awkward conversation with Monica, but she's very, very gracious. She's like, oh, maybe that was meant for you, you know? She gave it to me, but maybe it was meant for you. So she's been a lovely, supportive friend ever since early days.
Number 2 is on page 12. And I'd love if you could read that. People will get a sense, for those who haven't heard it. You did a reading for Planet Earth Poetry, and I intend to put a link on the blog post to that so people can hear you in a reading setting. But yeah, number 2, and then we can talk about that. That goes for a page and a half, and then the haiku at the end.
Sorry, you'll forgive me changing glasses. I'm just at that moment in life when the vision is really like wonky. I have like one distance for the computer, another for the page. Here's number 2. Oh, we didn't talk about the I Ching. I'll talk about it later. Here's number 2. Dear occupation, know your station, Wastin and Wong Ne Chung Gap, blast in the mishap of opium's cornucopia, the dope of East Asia co-prosperity, no apology after the golly of America's post-war reconstruction plus deduction paid by the rough stamp of made in Japan versus made in China, bullying fragrant harbors ever open shop. No stop, even on Sunday, my hawker rushes her cart into hiding as cops bop, your survival's illegal, watch the eagle, and praise the rule of law. Always say uncle when Sam comes knocking, no flocking or swarming in hordes or perils. Stay feral and leave the critters to the army of uniforms, British, Japanese, or PRC. Occupation's your vocation. Your relation makes a paste of yellow flesh, here to do picky duty with fingers nimble till they stumble, eyes precise until they slant, the cant of burnout under factory lights, burning special economic in Samjan, Gaolong, Chungking nest of my marginal brothers, watering the swamp, paved over in backwards rhetorics, clean as the mean or Mr., blistering all my black-haired sisters down to the last drop of blood, pus, coffee, or tea. Here's glee, here's a plea, my market stark as other blood marking Nanking, Manchukuo, or Hong Kong on Christmas Day, our modern Christian praying for deliverance of the kind of colonizer interned at Stanley, as all our brothers stagger mass rapes estimation at 10,000. I don't want to talk about it. I was so unhappy then. I'm happy now. I have you, little shoe, and pretty dress. My hair's a mess. Do you have to drive that ugly car, Star? Let's get away from him. He's ignorant. He doesn't know anything. And do you have lots of pretty friends in your nice school in Newfoundland, Newfoundland? I wanted to go to school. He made me stop at grade 3. I could have been smart like you, like your mama. All my children are so smart. I never thought my life would turn out this good. Buy me another set of those pajamas from Zeller, so comfy, cheap, elite, and pass me my Chanel, sweet smell of everything's gonna be all right. It takes a mountain to build a village at Yao Yatjin, an embargo to lose it.
The stay feral comment was one I underlined. And then I never thought my life would turn out this good. I have an American sentence that goes, my whole life flashed before my eyes. It was better than I remembered. Can you stay feral? I mean, the language is feral. So you're saying stay feral in a very wild kind of language, which I thought was pretty cool. But there's probably more to it than that.
Well, I mean, part of the poem is doing is hinging on rhyme, right? So feral rhymes with peril, which is not a mistake. So thinking about the ways in which Chinese people in particular were understood in America, in the US and in Canada, in one of the earlier waves of arrival as horde, as peril, as a threat, right, that comes to these Western shores in order to take from deserving white people. So there's that. And then, I've got to find it now. So the notion of plurality, I think, is interesting in relation to that sense of, having been taken in by the human, but then also retaining a sense of the wild, even as one is sort of inhabiting these urban spaces. And for those of me who those listeners who know me as a speculative fiction writer as well, right? We know that the notion of the human so much gets troped as whiteness. You just need to sort of think about the ways in which racial tropes are redeployed in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So the humans are always white, and then it's the non-human who are sort of figured as people of color. So this sense of being only partly human, of having some kind of connection to the animal. Of course, it's racist, right? To just be very clear, that figuration of racialized people as closer to animal belongs to 19th century racial theory that remains in our language and comes out in times of stress when people are feeling the hate. So it's a reclamation of that, though, and a reclamation of some element of connectivity to the quote unquote natural world. So interestingly, to get back to the question you were asking me about the I Ching, right? There's an embrace in this poem, to the best of my ability, of Chinese philosophical traditions that don't do the mind-body split. And if the mind-body split is not done and the human nature split is not done, and the I Ching sees that, sees um, plays of flows and plays of chance as kind of belonging to that thing that in a Western idiom we would call nature. And so the word feral, in a sense, is kind of catching a little bit of that, even as it's not breaking free of all this sort of racial connotation. And so there's a sort of spit back at the same time, right? You hear the rage in the use of the language, because this is the language I have, and this language is so freighted with crap that I don't really want, and yet now it's part of me.
Right. I remember when I was lost in the wilderness and waiting for a rescue helicopter, the things that went through my head, including, vitamin commercials and stuff like that. That kind of shit, you can't get it out. It comes up when you've been all alone for 5-6 days or whatever it is. There was a thought when you were talking about that, about your process, and I wonder, as you're composing, if you remember, there must be a split-second choice between sound or sense, between wordplay and quote-unquote content. Does that come up, or is that so far in the background when you're composing that it's not an issue?
Yeah, it comes up. Sure, yeah, it comes up. I compose slightly slower than I read, although not much, and these are composed very, very quickly. And so they have a certain roughness to them and the minute you try to polish it off, the poem stops working. I think the reason for that is that there's a certain accrual, there's a certain kind of stacking that happens both in sound and in whatever of meaning transfers forward. And so, yeah, sure, there are moments. It's that weird thing of, attending to those movements in the mind, and sometimes between the mind and the hand, I'm not always sure which possibility has presented itself first. So to the best of my ability, I was sort of trying to put onto the page the possibility that first presented itself, so the language that wants to come. But of course, there's always that little editorial bar in there that's kind of going, oh, did you mean to say feral or peril? Did you mean Shrek or Chiang Kai-shek? Which one actually came first? And now you have to decide. And after a while, you become quite neurotic about it. You make yourself quite ill because you have to do it. It's all happening so quickly. Paul, there must have been an element of choice, that if I put this pun down, I can get that rhyme later. Or if I lay this meaning out, I can get that meaning later. And in those sort of really lucky sort of poetical rolls of the dice, sometimes I'd also get a word that would give both. Right? So sometimes you get both this sort of the signification that you want and the sound that you want, and then that's the best. And that would be what I would aim for. But it was weird having to edit, right? And especially in those moments working with Trish in the poetics read, where it's like, oh, I really don't want to use that word. It's kind of offensive. But it rhymes, or it makes sense. Now what do I do? Right? Now what do I do? Yeah. And if I stick another word in there, do I choose for a close signification, or do I choose for a close sound? Is there one that can do both? And there, that was much more than we had long conversations about it in those moments. But compositionally, probably it's happening all the time. And so then that's a real gift, isn't it? When you get something that will sort of give you that polysemy that you want. Yeah.
When you were talking about the traditions that don't have that split between the mind and body, I mean, this is so central to my own story of doing public affairs interviews and gravitating towards alternative medicine, natural medicine folks who realize that we deal with things in a very symptomatic fashion. And in many of these public affairs interviews that I did back in the radio days, it was equating that allopathic medicine impulse to being the equivalent to American foreign policy, and that is find the bad part and kill it, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so having the mind body connected, I think that writing that is really embodied is incredibly marginal in our world, and especially with the force that academia gives certain kinds of writing. I
Yeah.
speak of Michael McClure, I guess, more than anyone else because he's one of my all-time poetry heroes. But I see very little writing that really is embodied. So it's almost as if that's the that's the last margin. Also, that line, "I never thought my life would turn out this good,"
Mhm.
is wonderful. Do you want to speak to that, or?
Sure, I'm channeling my grandmother. So I don't know if that's audible to listeners, but by the time, uh, yeah, when the poem says, I was so unhappy then, I was really starting to listen to her. Um, and she, Cantonese was her first language. She didn't have, she was very, 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 very smart human, but didn't have a lot of education. My great grandfather didn't believe in education for women. So I think she went to school until grade 3 and then he pulled her out. And, but she had all these kids who ended up being, so supportive. My family is half sports people and half academics. So she had all these kids who did all these sort of quite amazing things. And I think it's something that she thought about a lot. I think she also went through a lot of things in her life that, it's a pretty traditional thing for people, Chinese people, to not speak of the worst things that have happened to them. People just don't. It's bad luck. It passes it on to the next generation, and it's just not really what you do in order to have a good life. If you want to have a good life, you don't talk about the bad things. But I do know, little bits of things that happened to her. Some she told me, more that I sort of gleaned from watching her and my grandfather interacting with one another, little bits that my aunts have told me, little bits my mom has told me. And then one time she just came out and said this to me: I never thought my life would turn out this good. And I'm so happy I have you. So there's an element unfolding in this poem for sure, of this sort of guilt-ridden first world child, me, uh, trying to deal with and be responsible to the things that the earlier generations went through, the content of which I'm not entirely certain and can't name as fact. And so that, for me, that's what that little line is is doing, insofar as one is driving for meaning or biographical connection to something, which doesn't mean that readers can't do something else with it, if the desire or the impulse um, arises.
The Tao Te Ching is the current that runs through this whole book, mentioned in the haiku of poem number 8 on page 30, the Highborn number 9, among others. It's referenced. How do you use this in your daily life?
Oh, that's a hard question. I have no idea, Paul. How do I use the Tao Te Ching in my daily life?
Is it so
I'm,
much of the foundation of who you are that it's just, it's just there and can come out at any time, or is there a practice?
I don't practice. Not well. Do I? I think you're right that there's an element of it's just there and it's part of who I am. It's part of. I'm not. I mean, I would imagine that it's something inherited, right, in a sort of practiced way through mom and dad. I would imagine. My mom was a philosopher who wrote, did her PhD on the relationship between the I Ching and Leibniz's philosophy. Don't ask me to say anything more about that because I can't. But I know that she was sort of actively thinking, if not about the Tao Te Ching, about the I Ching in her work. She never got a job, so the career didn't really, but that was sort of the thinking she was doing. And I imagine she thinks about it and practices it, although she doesn't really talk about it. But I do have a strong sense of, having inherited an ethical stance toward the world that comes from them. It's practice-based. But because they don't talk about it a whole heck of a lot, I don't even know how much of it is conscious for them and how much of it is not. I'm just sort of aware that when I find myself, in sites of struggle in whatever form, the way that I'm thinking about it is not the way that people around me are thinking about it. And so in my early 20s, it was more the I Ching that I worked with, because I guess who doesn't do this in one's 20s, right? You want to know what the future is going to be, and so you're looking for something predictive. And so tarot cards and the I Ching were a thing. And the I Ching is obviously much more than that. It doesn't really predict at all. It offers just a way of being in relation with others that the more I sit with it, the more powerful I'm finding it. And even, the way the hexagrams are structured, right? Where actually the whole line and the broken line, the relationship between them is dialectic. So pure metal Marxism, all that sort of punk rock, dukes up, dialectic battling that I was doing, right? When I was a sociology student in the 80s, suddenly appears again in the I Ching, but it's subordinated to the circle. And that totally makes sense to me. Right. Which is why, I keep fighting when it's necessary to fight, and sometimes it's called for. But there are other times when you're at another spot in the circle and you need to do something else. It's not necessarily always about action. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And it's a much more sort of subtle set of teachings than, the Grundrisse or something like that.
Yeah, mine are the runes, and one of the runes says, "Never start a fight, but if you find yourself in a fight, make sure you finish."
Yeah.
Let me see. Talk to us about how composing a long poem is. But although, if we talk about the composition of a long poem, you go back to your discussion of how this was a rant block, and you just kind of chopped it up into Highborn. So, is that part of? I've not read your previous two books, but do you conceive of a book before you start writing it, or do you just start writing and see what happens to it? Because the way I came up, through Robin Blazer, Jack Spicer, serial form, always thinking in terms of books or in terms of projects. I love the way that Blazer not only thought in terms of specific books, but then the whole thing was a book itself, The Holy Forest. I just think that's an amazing model, and I love it so much. Is that similar to how you do it, or is it not?
Blazer was an amazing man. I don't know, Paul. It sort of feels like there's multiple starting points.
Mhm.
And so in one starting point, I don't have a clue. But then in other starting points, I don't know. So for Sybil was a series of 4 long poems in the earlier poetry book, where I did sort of conceive of them as long poems. There were subject matters that I had in mind as sort of like initiating jump off points, and then structures that presented themselves quite quickly. And then with the fiction, I listened for voices. But fiction is a very different matter because it's such a conservative, the novel is such, even when you're playing with it, even when you're experimenting with it, there are certain conventions that if you break them, people won't follow you. So the novel is different.
Or you turn into Richard Brautigan.
Sorry, say again?
Or you turn into Richard Brautigan. Very, very non-linear kind of quote unquote novel, really more of a poem that Jack Spicer assisted,
Okay.
you know.
Like my friend Robert Mazel's, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
Um,
no.
you know, I love in the end of the book, the acknowledgments, this wide range, and I alluded to it in my introduction, this wide Bing Crosby, Thompson twins, Andy Warhol, W.B. Yeats, Leonard Cohen, Michael Jackson, including our Mozart and the Dead Milkmen, Jim Henson, and the Carpenters, Mao Zedong, and others. I love how you do that and how they come up um, through the poem. And William Carlos Williams, who comes up a couple of times, or references to, allusions to him in haiku number 17, a reference to the red wheelbarrow, and then also in number 37, page 102. How is Williams a source for your work, or is he just part of the canon that just comes up sort of like through the substrate? Or
It's a source in a really elliptical way because my good friend Roy Meeky did his PhD dissertation on Williams. And so I'm inheriting Williams directly through Roy, who's another friend, another teacher. I think Williams is sort of always hovering there in the background in Roy's work. And of course, for Roy, you know, the work with Williams was, he was interested in experimental poetry and poetics, and he's aware of his own racialized body, and Williams is as well. And so that engagement is there. I haven't made, it's not a really, really concerted one. It's, for me, it's a little bit of a hee-haw, you know, the chickens with the chickens and the wheelbarrow.
yeah, 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 yeah.
I can't say that I've taken him on particularly seriously. He's sort of there as part of the constellation of, you know, predecessors, I guess, that I inherit in a really particular way, right? When you're talking about all those Black Mountain guys, I'm inheriting them through Roy and Fred. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No, there's certainly not. They were wonderful teachers.
Um, Other sort of themes that come up in and out of the book, Rita Wong, Saint Iris.
Yeah, sure.
Rita, of course, legendary poet, activist, and not to be messed with.
Oh, not to be messed with. And one of my dearest friends. And so, in fact, you know, my first poetry book, Automaton, but biographies, was written simultaneously with a long poem, a collaborative long poem that I did with Rita called Kibble and Rest. And I learned so much about poetry from writing with her. And so she remains a presence and an interlocutor always. I think I'm always talking to her. You know, you're right. She's so not to be messed with. She's such a fighter. She's a really powerful activist and poet. You know, in many ways, one whose hem I feel I can never touch. She's like a better person, like a gooder person than me by, you know, 100 million miles. And yet she keeps me hanging around and I keep her hanging around. And it does often feel like a conversation. So if there's something unfolding with Rita in this book, because Rita is often a lot more clear about what the politics are and what needs to be done. And I think if I have both a strength and a flaw, it's I can never decide. And so I often find myself in my poetry talking to her because in Sybil, we were talking to one another. And she was saying, but you have to do it like this. And I'm like, if you do it like that, you know, you're going to create this, and this problem. And she's like, but the right thing to do is this. And I'll be saying, well, yeah, but if you do that, you're going to hurt so-and-so, or you're going to upset this, or, you know, do you really want to be? So that's the conversation. And there's an element of that I think is probably continuing. It's there in Automaton as well. And I think it's here in this one. And then, sorry, who else were you asking about?
Saint Iris.
Saint Iris. So I'm thinking about Iris Chang, whose work I cannot read. So she was the a historian, sort of popular historian who was writing about the atrocities committed in the rape of Nanking, which was perpetrated, you know, by the fascist Japanese Imperial Army on a Chinese city. The atrocities were just unspeakable. I won't name them. There's no point. I mean, it's just it's horrible. And of course she died, right? I think just of the sheer grief of what it was that she was uncovering it. Who can hold that?
Right.
Who can, like, it's not something you can witness in the brutality is just too intense. And I think that that's something, I think especially in this historical moment, people tend to forget how much Chinese people have suffered. And because China is so much on the rise now, because it's banging its drum so hard, because so much of the wealth of China is finding its way to North America. And so we, especially in a city, where I've spent so much of my adult life in Vancouver, it's there on the street. There's a lot of racial animus against it. But of course, it's only a very small and particular part of the worldwide Chinese population that one is seeing. And it's forgetting the history of even those people, even those who have made good, become wealthy. And so I think about her a lot, to think about, I think about Nanking, I think about Manchuria, and I think about Hong Kong, because they were in Hong Kong as well. And the brutality in Hong Kong, so my grandmother doesn't talk. I don't know what it is that she's not talking about. But Iris Chang is there for me as a figure who had the courage to look back, to look back and then to turn to stone, right? Because I think there is something indeed holy, something spiritual about the work she was doing. But who can hold that?
Yeah.
I don't know. So I carry her with me for sure.
I hate to tip the ending. What do they call that? What do they call that when they don't want to tell you the ending? If you want to read,
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. That's right. 64, the last one in the book. It's a page long, and then there's a haiku. That might be a good way to end our chat, and then I'll maybe ask you one or two follow-up questions, and we'll let you go on your way. But there's another Tao poem here.
Sure. Oh, this glasses situation. One of these days. 64. Dear Tao, old rotary turtle shell squeal whistling in flames to name the hell of a revolutionary god. I split my cod, debone its spine to line a whispered history. Astronauts' impossible labor climbs back down millennia, returns to Earth. The E of Qing blusters to Shang ancestry, priestess geomancer of a bad romance. I'll take a chance on democracy from below, glowing in the slow heat of another ember. Guilt shines beneath quilt of magpies flashing shimmery feathers as Protestant lies down on her bed of nails, dials dialectic for that long distance feeling, beguiled by the gush of blood staining the shroud of her own making. What king could ding this, melt dragons in cauldrons to brew a better soup? I stoop, loop Yue for Tinhao, Grun Yum for ocean goers, Avalokiteshvara of the long march across deserts, Bodhisattva of water, Queen Mother of a different West, rescues father and brothers from massive spiral sea to sky storm. Now her incense coil burns above, snakes from ceiling of wet temple, steps from station of the cross. We were not yet Chinese when Shang was ancient. I dream my being returned to weavers once and future North Star. Dear Tongyan, I pilot my ship on South China Sea, blink my split toenail, cast net for wishes, bungle my smuggle for a pot of rice steamed with salted fish. Echo wagers cap against standard, cues pool table to return love's body, in remembered alphabets, lunar pull. Yeah,
Wonderful. A hopeful feel at the end of the book, as I guess might be appropriate. The Iron Goddess besides being a kind of oolong tea, um, does the Iron Goddess prevail through this age of crisis, through all the things I mentioned, to a better world in which um, people are treated based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin?
Does she prevail? I don't know. I don't know, Paul. I mean, I think she's there. I mean, isn't that one of the wonderful things about the gods and goddesses, right? The spirit world is there, these sort of permeative presences, these eternal presences that don't leave us. Does that mean that we get to land somewhere good, where we whatever ideal it is that we might hold up arrives and doesn't depart again? And I would say the answer to that is probably no. That's the point of working with the I Ching, right? Everything's constant motion, everything is change, everything is constantly in flux and flow. And even as you're given something that seems in your eyes to be good, there's a lining that's, there's a lining, or there's other parts that are not so good, and vice versa. When you're given a disaster, often something productive rises out of it, right? Isn't there there's a traditional story, what do you call it, where, the story about a man, he finds a horse and thinks he's so lucky, and he puts his son on the horse, and the son falls off the horse and breaks his leg, and he thinks it was so unlucky to find the horse, right? But then the army comes recruiting, but actually press ganging young men into war, and the farmer's son doesn't have to go to war because he has a broken leg, and so the horse turned out to be good after all. I think that's, I don't know, the older I get, the more I'm in this world, the more aware I am of the world as a field of change, in which any of the things that we might want, including, being judged for one's character rather than the color of one's skin, right? Which I do think is a wonderful ideal, but it also comes out of a particular tradition that was perpetrating, ideas of race through the colonial project at the same time, and in fact producing it. And I don't think we ever get away from that. But I still think it's good to hold up ideals. So I'm not saying throw them out. We still have to have them. We don't dream them. We don't get to have them. I have this long essay called Emergent Utopias, or sometimes I'll say Emergent Insurgency, where I think about that, as a problem, that the necessity of having ideals, the necessity of utopian thinking, but the impossibility of actually arriving there. And because there's so many of us all acting or not acting in relation to one another, we can't know what the outcome's going to be. But I think the poets, at least, and maybe some others as well, can know to pay attention to those moments when there is something like hope, right? Or fairness or justice bubbling up for a second, even if it flits away again. So I don't know, is that hopeful or is that really pessimistic, or both?
It seems to me rich with negative capability, and I think that's a good place to be. Well, I want to tell you what a honor and a privilege it is to be able to engage you in this very deep and intimate way about your work. I think the work is very important. It's a beautiful poem, and I'm delighted to renew our connection and wish you continued success, health, and happiness.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for being so thoughtful about the work and engaging me in so generously in this conversation. Really appreciate it.